Hello, welcome to the channel Why Stories. Enjoy watching.
A year ago, Clara lost everything. After her divorce, she returned to where she had once started, a tiny room inherited from her grandmother, with nothing but a suitcase of belongings and an emptiness inside. One night, coming home after her shift, she noticed a car in the parking lot with its door slightly open. Inside sat a man, barely breathing, clutching an empty inhaler with trembling fingers. Without hesitation, Clara saved him. But when she found out who he was, she was left speechless. The air carried a scent commonly associated with luxury, something light, proud, and weightless all at once. Skillful perfumers had blended warm wood, vanilla, and a hint of tropical flowers into this mesmerizing aroma. For some reason, it was impossible to recreate at home. This was the scent of high-end hotels, expensive restaurants, and designer boutiques. I could sit in this chair forever, Esther sighed dreamily, watching the bubbles rise in her champagne glass. Moments like this make you believe the world revolves around you. I'm not sure about the whole world, but that boutique assistant definitely thinks so, Miriam nodded toward the store employee. Just then, the friendly saleswoman approached the two friends, carrying several dresses in her hands. I'm going to try them on, Esther announced, placing her half-empty champagne glass on the table before disappearing into the fitting room. The attentive assistant held the dresses for her, ready to go above and beyond to please the customers. When's the event? Miriam asked, crossing her legs. In just a couple of days, came Esther's voice from behind the curtain. Some guy named Daniel proposed to his lady, and they decided to celebrate officially. You know, like in America, there'll be a cocktail party, fireworks, live music. He even rented a fancy villa outside the city with a pool and a garden for the occasion. So, naturally, I want to show up with Daniel looking my absolute best. Must be nice, Miriam drawled, finishing her champagne. If they're spending this much on an engagement party, imagine what the wedding will be like. With a soft chime, the curtain was drawn back, revealing Esther in a stunning gold sequined dress with an open back. The saleswoman immediately began showering her with compliments. Miriam gave her friend a critical once-over and frowned. There were still plenty of dresses left on the rack. There was no need to rush. After 2 more glasses of champagne, the friends finally emerged from the shopping mall with their purchase and headed to the parking lot to wait for a taxi. Both were in high spirits. About 6 months ago, Esther had married a promising man. Daniel was the director of a prestigious car dealership. She had no shame in telling her friends how she had stolen him from a frumpy little nurse. As soon as their relationship was official, Esther quit her job and started planning small business ventures of her own. Listen and learn, Miriam, Esther lectured. You don't find a good man, you take him from the plain Jane who, for some incomprehensible reason, ended up next to him. Miriam listened, but had no intention of following in Esther's footsteps. She believed in karma and preferred to make her own way. Now, let's go get the shoes. They're in another boutique. I called ahead, and they promised to hold them for me, so we need to. Esther's cheerful chatter suddenly stopped mid-sentence. What? Miriam glanced at her friend and only then noticed that Esther was staring intently at something in the parking lot. Turning her head, she saw what had caught Esther's attention. Near a sleek black luxury car, a driver in a crisp white shirt and dark trousers was helping a petite woman in a light dress load shopping bags into the trunk. Then he opened the rear passenger door for the clearly distinguished woman, assisted her into the seat with a respectful hand, and finally took his place behind the wheel. The car smoothly pulled away, its perfectly polished exterior gleaming under the lights. Esther, what's wrong? Miriam waved a hand in front of her friend's face. Hey! Esther shook her head and squeezed her eyes shut. Miriam, either I'm losing my eyesight or I've gone insane, she finally said. But I swear, Daniel's frumpy little ex-wife just got into that car. No way, that's impossible, Miriam said, stunned. You must be mistaken. If there's one thing I never mistake, it's my husband's exes, Esther argued. That was her, just with a different haircut and in a dress worth her entire hospital salary for a month. Right, and with a personal driver, Miriam scoffed. Come on, Esther, it was just someone who looks like her. Who would hire that kind of service for a nurse? Esther knew Miriam's logic made sense, but her own eyes had told her something completely different just moments ago. There was no way that messy, plain Clara had transformed in a single year into a fashionable woman shopping with this level of luxury. She swatted away a tiny insect persistently buzzing near her face. So, are we getting those shoes or not? The taxi's already waiting, Miriam asked, nodding toward the car. Esther responded absent-mindedly. Daniel glanced over his desk. Everything was perfect. Everything in its place. His suit was impeccable. The dealership had met its sales target this month. His bonus was already secured. The new manager was in training. The contract for the next batch of cars had been signed. Ideal. On days like this, Daniel was in an excellent mood. He descended from his office on the second floor, where floor-to-ceiling windows gave him a commanding view, down to the showroom, observing how the young sales reps attended to customers. As soon as he stepped onto the sales floor, he sent a young female employee to fetch him a coffee and casually took her seat, sprawling in the chair as he surveyed his domain. Daniel had been the dealership's director for about 10 months. He had started here himself, young and inexperienced, but within 4 years, he had climbed to the very top. The showroom doors slid open silently, and a man walked in. Immediately, Daniel noticed that the new manager, Gabriel Ramos, was heading toward the visitor. Having worked in sales for years, Daniel had developed an almost instinctive ability to distinguish serious buyers from mere window shoppers or time wasters. And this particular man triggered nothing but distaste. Disheveled hair, faded jeans, rolled-up sleeves of a plain but not particularly clean shirt, dirty sneakers. Gabriel did his best, presenting one model, then another. The customer inspected the cars carefully, asking questions that visibly baffled the young salesperson. Daniel clicked his tongue and decided to step in. Gabriel, take a break. I'll handle this, he said, nodding at the new hire as he temporarily took over his role. How can I help you? Good afternoon, the customer greeted him. I want to surprise my wife for her birthday, but I don't see the car in the color I need. He named a specific model and gestured around the showroom. Daniel recalled that the requested color was only available in the fully loaded version, meaning it was significantly more expensive. Such cars were brought in exclusively by special order. Unfortunately, we don't have it in stock, Daniel said, narrowing his eyes as he studied the man again. But it can be ordered with a 30% deposit. The wait time is about 3 weeks. No, that's too long for me, the man shook his head. Is there no way to get it faster? Daniel was surprised, but didn't let it show. Well, of course, he said, stretching his lips into a smile. But in that case, full payment is required up front. If you do that, we can have it here in 5 days. We just need to fill out the contract. He motioned to Gabriel, who quickly handed him a stack of papers. Daniel passed the contract to the customer, watching as the man skimmed through the lines, turned the page, read further, and then asked. It says here that if there are any issues with the car at the time of delivery, the dealership bears no responsibility. Yes, that's the condition for expedited orders, Daniel confirmed. So you're asking me to pay for a pig in a poke? The man shut the contract, shook his head disapprovingly, and handed the papers back. Thanks, but I'll find my wife's gift elsewhere. Have a good day. He turned and headed toward the exit. Daniel rolled his eyes, muttering under his breath, assuming the customer wouldn't hear. These village folks, always showing up uninvited. The man hesitated for just a second at the door, but then walked out without a word. Remember this, Gabriel, Daniel shoved the unused contract back into the employee's hands. Don't even waste time on guys like that. No money, just ridiculous demands. And call the cleaning lady, will you? Get the floors washed after that mess. That evening, Daniel picked up his wife. Esther and Miriam had spent the entire day together, preparing for their upcoming grand entrance into high society. They had talked and laughed endlessly, sipping champagne as they shopped. One of the couple's favorite evening pastimes was gossiping about everyone they had encountered that day. As soon as Esther placed her shopping bags in the back seat and slid into the car, she immediately unloaded her revelation onto Daniel. "I swear on my new shoes, it was your ex-wife," she declared with absolute confidence. Daniel listened with mild interest, but then he wrinkled his nose and replied carelessly, "Where would she get the money for shopping sprees and business-class taxis?" "Oh, please. I took the apartment in the divorce. There's no way a clueless little thing like her could charm her way up to the chief doctor. The only thing she has left is that tiny room and a suitcase of old junk." "Maybe she inherited something," Esther suggested. "Highly unlikely," Daniel stated with confidence. "There were never any rich people in her family. Her parents live in a one-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of the city. Her grandmother signed over her room to her when she was 15. And as for uncles and aunts, I doubt they even remember she exists. So no, it definitely wasn't Clara. Relax." Esther leaned back in her seat, finally feeling reassured. The thought that Daniel's once plain and dull ex-wife could now afford designer shoes had somehow deeply unsettled her. "No, it's impossible. End of discussion. Daniel, why did you even get involved with her? Couldn't you find someone better?" Esther giggled. "I was young and stupid," Daniel replied in the same light-hearted tone. "Didn't know much about women back then." As he spoke, he took Esther's hand and brushed his lips over her knuckles. Flattered by the silent compliment and tipsy from the champagne, Esther finally convinced herself that her eyes had deceived her in the parking lot earlier. "So, how was your day?" she asked, leaning into her husband. "Some broke, scruffy idiot wandered into the dealership after lunch," Daniel began. "Life has a strange way of bringing together people who are completely wrong for each other. And it's often only obvious from the outside. The lovers themselves stubbornly refuse to see how different their worldviews are, how the friction between them keeps increasing, how more and more is left unsaid, and how the person they once loved keeps slipping lower and lower on their list of priorities." Clara and Daniel met at the wedding of mutual friends. That night, the 29-year-old nurse fell head over heels for the charming 31-year-old friend of the groom. They danced a lot, talked endlessly, drank together, and spent the entire evening side by side. And they left the wedding together as well. At the time, both were single, a little drunk, and saw no reason not to spend the night together. A month later, Clara realized she was pregnant. The news hit Daniel like a hammer to the head. At the time, he was working at a small private bicycle shop and was in no way ready for a child. But in the end, his sense of responsibility won out, and he proposed to Clara. The wedding was rushed, with little preparation. However, both sets of parents had a surprise planned, and that surprise was almost enough to buy a brand new, spacious two-bedroom apartment. The couple had to take out a loan for the remaining amount, but that seemed like a small matter. After all, neither of them had a decent place to live before. Daniel had been renting a modest apartment, while Clara had been living in the tiny room she had inherited from her grandmother. They weren't reaching for the stars. It was difficult for both of them to transition from their independent lives to a shared family routine. But Clara was blindly in love with Daniel, and because of that, she forgave his sharp words, his rough attitude, and his broken promises. Fate, however, had its own plans for their marriage. In the 4th month of her pregnancy, Clara lost the baby. They managed to save her. She spent about a week in the hospital, but no one could give her a clear explanation for the tragedy. Clara had dreamed of becoming a mother, and she wept bitterly into her hospital pillow at night. Daniel, on the other hand, didn't seem particularly upset. In fact, he almost seemed relieved. He had other plans. "Daniel, we'll still have kids, won't we?" Clara asked him after she was discharged from the hospital, as they sat down for dinner that evening. "Sweetheart, why are you thinking about kids right now? You nearly died the first time, and you want to go through that again?" Daniel focused on his plate, not even looking at her. "Let's wait. We'll settle down, get on our feet. You'll get checked out, do all the tests, and then we'll see." Clara nodded sadly. She decided to listen to him. After all, her husband was right. She couldn't just rush into pregnancy like a stray cat. What if the nightmare repeated itself? It was better to figure things out first, to wait and be patient. And under that pretense, 2 years slipped by. Daniel was perfectly content. He had a wife who worked and was easy to manage. He could focus all his energy on building his career. After bouncing between different jobs and interviews, Daniel landed an internship at a car dealership thanks to a connection. His eyes lit up at the opportunities that lay ahead. This wasn't some cramped bike shop or a dusty furniture showroom. People who came to buy cars weren't poor, which meant he could earn a lot. He just had to give it his all. And he did. First, he was promoted to senior manager. After some time, he became the assistant director. That was when Daniel started looking at Clara with a hint of disgust. At home, he was always greeted by the same scene: his exhausted wife after a long hospital shift, bland food, and a dull apartment. Clara hadn't even changed her haircut in 5 years. All she ever talked about was hospital work and children, running from one doctor to another, trying for years to get the medical care she needed. But in the public healthcare system, even with connections, nothing happened quickly. He was sick of it. By then, he didn't even want to sleep in the same bed as his wife. Meanwhile, Daniel was making good money. He bought himself a sleek foreign car, upgraded his wardrobe with increasingly expensive suits, and indulged in the latest high-end gadgets. He quickly paid off the remaining debt on the apartment. And, naturally, women began paying him obvious attention, drawn to his growing success. His melancholic, long-suffering wife didn't fit into this new image at all. Eventually, Daniel started an affair with Esther, an attractive woman who worked next door at an insurance company. They often went to lunch together, and before long, they stopped hiding their near-official relationship. Esther wasn't bothered by the fact that Daniel was married. She had heard how he spoke about his wife, with disgust and contempt, and had even looked at Clara's social media photos herself. Plain. Dressed in cheap sweaters. Hair always tied back in a ponytail. A round, forgettable face. Pathetic. Dull. Esther began pushing the idea of divorce. But, in truth, she didn't even have to try that hard. The moment Daniel learned he was being considered for the position of dealership director, he knew Clara, with her whining and dreary presence, belonged in the past. He filed for divorce himself. His wife, shocked, stared at him with tear-filled eyes, unable to comprehend. "Why, Daniel?" "For what?" "You disgust me," he wrinkled his nose. "You're not a woman, you're a mistake. It's always the hospital, or your whining, or your dreams of having a whole litter of kids. And look at yourself, gray, miserable, like a moth. Ugh. Find someone on your level. I don't need a woman like you." And without bothering to explain further, Daniel started packing his things. Clara sat quietly crying as he rushed back and forth between the closet and the dresser. She didn't fully understand what was happening. Not until her now ex-husband coldly won the apartment in court and ordered her to get lost. There was nothing she could do. She packed her things from the half-empty apartment she had once loved and dragged herself back to her grandmother's old room. Her parents barely had enough space as it was. And just like that, in a matter of weeks, Clara went from being a married woman to a plain, abandoned nobody. "Well, here we are," she muttered, standing in front of her room's door, holding a suitcase in one hand and a cat carrier in the other. "Back to square one, Damon." The cat rubbed its cheek against the carrier's grid, showing that it didn't care where it lived, as long as it was with its beloved owner. As Clara stepped into the space of her old home, it seemed to her that those years of marriage had never happened. There was no lost child, no divorce, and none of the pain that Daniel had caused her. The lilac curtains still swayed welcomingly on the window, familiar paintings looked down from the walls, and the tip of the teapot from her grandmother's china set peeked out from the sideboard. Clara sat down on the sofa, leaned back against the backrest, and closed her eyes, listening to herself. She needed to gather her strength and start life anew. No one had said it would be easy, but sitting and crying from her own helplessness was certainly not the answer. The days of her new life stretched on. Spring was drawing to a close, and nature was rejoicing in the new season of warmth and sunshine, as though Clara had paid dearly to chirp so carelessly like the sparrows in the bushes. But instead, old wounds flared up in her soul, turning into painful abscesses. She thought, tried to understand why. Occasionally, her mother added oil to this smoldering fire of painful thoughts. Well, what was wrong with him, her mother complained during her rare visits. He was a decent guy. Worked, didn't drink, didn't fool around. But no, you had to get divorced. How should I know, Mom? Clara replied weakly. And he's no fool, obviously. He got the apartment, into which our money was invested, her mother continued, reproaching her daughter. You should appeal the decision and file again. Mom, leave it, Clara plugged her ears like a little child. I can barely get out of bed in the morning to go to work. And I definitely don't have the energy or money for a lawyer to go to court. The conversation was over. This happened more than once. At first, her mother pitied her, but then she would start reproaching her. The same old pattern, tired beyond belief. Clara had one solace, her job. She had worked as a nurse in a children's clinic for many years, and she loved what she did with all her heart. She dreamed of going further and entering residency, but she could never save enough money for the tuition. It had been 3 weeks since Clara moved back to her old home. It felt strange returning to a small room after the large apartment. However, instead of the eternally grumpy husband, she was now greeted by the joyful meowing of her cat Damon. Gradually, a sense of warmth began to fill her heart. The evening light of the fading day gently caressed the tree crowns and rooftops, lazily crawled along the sidewalks, leaving long shadows. It flared up in the windows with fiery bursts. Clara was returning home from work. She had been caught up in paperwork for too long, and in order to clear her mind, she decided to take a walk. As luck would have it, the path led her past the car dealership where her ex-husband worked. To avoid stirring up painful memories and ruining her mood, Clara turned in the opposite direction. The path was longer, but it meant she wouldn't have to worry about unwanted encounters. During such walks, the woman tried to take in everything happening around her. The passers-by, cars, shop windows, clouds in the sky, birds on the wires, dogs napping in the shade. Today, Clara was doing the same, looking around step by step, moving forward. And suddenly, her gaze fell on something that didn't match the evening calm. Ahead, in the parking lot, was a blue car with a half-open door, and from behind it, a man's limp hand was dangling, barely trembling. It was surprising that no one else, except Clara, noticed this. The thought took no more than a second. The woman rushed into the parking lot and opened the car door all the way. Inside, the man was almost unconscious, about 40 years old, fit, in a shirt and jeans, with a short, neat haircut. He was weakly twitching and gasping for air. "What's wrong?" "I'm a doctor." "Is it hard for you to breathe?" Clara's blood was pounding in her temples. Instead of answering, the man weakly opened his eyes and began groping with his trembling hand on the seat. Then he pulled out an inhaler. Clara realized she hadn't been mistaken. It was an asthma attack. She immediately unbuttoned the collar of his shirt to free his chest. The inhaler made a sharp, empty sound when pressed. "It's empty!" Clara cried out in horror. "I'll go get another one, just hold on, please." "Calm down, try breathing through your nose, lean your head against the seat." The man barely nodded, showing that he understood and agreed. But his face grew paler, and his chest rose with rapid, sharp, and abnormal breaths. She had to hurry. Clara rushed across the street at the crosswalk. She heard cursing and honking behind her. Caught up in an adrenaline rush, Clara didn't even glance at the traffic light. The pharmacy was around the corner, 5 minutes away. The nurse burst in, disheveled, with wide, panicked eyes. "Hurry, an inhaler, someone's in trouble," she shouted as soon as she saw the pharmacist behind the glass. Half a minute later, the terminal beeped, signaling the completed purchase. Clara hurried back to the parking lot. Fortunately, the situation hadn't worsened, and the man was still conscious. Clara shipped the inhaler she'd bought and placed it in the man's hand. A couple of puffs, and almost before her eyes, the ailment began to recede. "I don't even know how to thank you," the man said when his breathing had returned to normal and his cheeks flushed with color. "I was already saying goodbye to life right here." "You can't be so careless with your illness," Clara said with concern. "Asthma can kill. You should buy extra inhalers and always have one on hand." "You really scared me. With my schedule, I sometimes forget my own name, let alone buy an inhaler," the stranger smiled awkwardly. "But yes, you're right. You don't mess around with these kinds of illnesses." He paused, looking at something on the dashboard. "Let me take you home. It's already dark, and it's not very safe to walk the streets alone at this hour," he offered. Clara studied her conversation partner carefully. "Are you sure you're feeling okay? Maybe you should hold off on driving?" She scanned the man from head to toe, almost worried about another attack. "I assure you, I'm fine now and perfectly capable of turning the wheel and pressing the pedals," the car owner smiled. "Well, I guess I'll agree," Clara sighed and nodded, "but please, drive slowly." The car pulled out of the parking lot and merged into the flow of traffic on the street. Suddenly, Clara realized why she had agreed. She herself didn't feel entirely well. Suddenly, the man slapped his forehead with his hand so abruptly that Clara even flinched in the passenger seat. "You saved my life, and I didn't even ask your name," the driver turned to her. "I'm a real gentleman, aren't I?" Clara smiled and introduced herself. "Nice to meet you." "I'm Raphael," the man replied. "Are you really a doctor?" "Nurse," Clara corrected him. "I was just coming back from work when I ran into you." An easy conversation started flowing naturally about work, the coming summer, and miraculous rescue stories. Before they knew it, the car had pulled up to the entrance of Clara's courtyard. "Thank you for the ride," she nodded gratefully as she got out of the car. "Don't mention it, I should be thanking you," Raphael said, rummaging through the glove compartment. "Here, take this. If you ever need anything at all, call me." He handed Clara a dark blue business card. "And you, take care of yourself, please," she mumbled, her gaze dropping. "It's not guaranteed that I'll be there next time." In response, Raphael winked at her and nodded, signaling that he would follow her advice. It was only when the car disappeared into the distance under the yellowish glow of the street lamp that Clara finally noticed the business card. The paper claimed that the man she had saved on the parking lot was the owner of an agricultural machinery factory, Raphael Saavedra. Esther's morning began around noon. Her head still buzzed from the champagne she had drunk the night before with her friend. Bags full of yesterday's purchases were piled on the bedroom chair. Daniel had left early, and his side of the bed was already cold and empty. Esther stretched, then awkwardly sat up. She needed to get moving, get ready, and head to the salon in the evening to trim the ends and refresh her hair color. She was planning to be the queen of the evening, celebrating the engagement of her husband's friends. Half an hour later, with 2 effervescent tablets to cure her hangover, there was no trace left of the headache. Esther was sitting on a high stool at the kitchen bar, sipping coffee, waiting for the fabric mask on her face to work its magic. Meanwhile, she was scrolling through current news on her laptop. "Let's see what kind of friend Daniel has and who he threw such a party for," Esther mumbled to herself, clicking the mouse. After a few clicks, the network helpfully opened a page for her, Miguel Mares, a young man. After reviewing the content, Esther realized that Daniel and Miguel had once studied together in college, and since Daniel's recent car purchase, they had been socializing more. Miguel ran his own PR agency, which was evident from the photos in the business album. Esther scrolled further and came across Miguel's fiancée. Lola, not bad, quite interesting, Esther commented to herself, studying the petite blonde in the photo. I'll have to act like I know something about her. She clicked the mouse again, flipping through more virtual images. And suddenly, a sight appeared on the screen that she definitely hadn't expected. Another photo, apparently taken in a fancy restaurant, showed Miguel with his fiancée, an unfamiliar older man, and Daniel's ex-wife. Esther stared at the screen with wide eyes. She then pulled back, squinted tightly, shook her head, and looked at the laptop again. Nothing had changed. The photo was still vivid, and Clara in it was as joyful and beautiful as ever. Esther briefly thought that the picture might have been taken before Daniel's marriage, but the date of the post told a different story, 7 months ago. No, this can't be, the woman exclaimed loudly into the empty apartment. This can't be happening. Esther spent about 10 minutes in a daze, alternating between staring at the photo and pushing the laptop away. With her experienced eye, she analyzed Clara's dress, her jewelry, and her hairstyle and makeup. The poor nurse certainly couldn't afford any of that. Eventually, Esther tried to find out something about the man who was tenderly holding Clara's waist in the picture. But there was no tag on the photo. And among Miguel's friends, Esther couldn't find anyone resembling him. Curiosity and anger slowly consumed her. And then, out of nowhere, envy crept in. At first, she grabbed the phone, ready to call Daniel, but she stopped just in time. Her hysteria wouldn't have been appreciated by her husband. He didn't like talking about his ex-wife or his past life. Especially now, when he had a high executive position. But curiosity still gnawed at Esther. Her ego was wounded and wouldn't give her peace. Was Esther afraid that the now beautiful Clara might steal her husband? Not at all. But looking worse than the disheveled woman who used to work in insurance? That was truly terrifying. A little freckled boy was sitting on his grandmother's lap, listening as she quietly read him fairy tales from a colorful book. This heartwarming scene was unfolding right in the hospital corridor. Other little patients and their parents were noisily waiting their turn to see the doctor. The children were whining, fidgeting, and running around, while the grandmother and grandson seemed oblivious to all of this, sitting in the corner on a worn-out couch, lost in their magical world. "Clara, are you here?" someone called from behind, interrupting the nurse who had been gazing at the scene for so long. Clara immediately shook off the dreamy and relaxed mood. She had been watching the patients, standing around the corner of the hallway, with such a wistful look as though someone had been reading her fairy tales. "Is everything okay?" her colleague Elsa peeked into Clara's face. Yes, sorry," Clara shook off her daydreams and turned to her colleague. "Did you need something?" "Yes," Elsa replied, irritably tossing her head, "my husband's on the line. We're buying last-minute vacation packages. Can't wait. And the chief doctor urgently needs a medical chart, this one here. I can't find it. They told me at the reception that part of the shelves weren't even rearranged after the shift, and it's in the storage room on the lower floor, near the trauma unit. As a favor, Clara, help me out and find that darn chart." Elsa handed her a piece of paper with a name and made a pleading face. "Fine, but you owe me some candy later," Clara agreed. "I have a break for now, anyway." Elsa beamed with joy and quickly ran off, still talking passionately on the phone. Clara decided not to waste time at the reception and went straight to search for the lost medical chart in the hospital's storage room. The trauma unit was on the first floor but had a separate entrance. Clara quickly circled the building and arrived at the trauma unit, where on one side was the reception office and on the other was the X-ray room. The corridor wasn't empty. There were a few people waiting for their turn. A high school boy with a cast on his leg and crutches, a whiny girl with a bandaged arm, and a boy around 10 or 11 years old pressing an ice pack to his left palm. Clara walked past and reached for the storage room door when she heard a familiar voice behind her. "Marcos, your hand is almost turning white. Take the ice off, or the doctor will think it's frostbite, not a fracture," someone called. Clara turned around and locked eyes with the speaker. "Clara, is that really you?" Raphael exclaimed, standing up from his seat, surprised and happy. Not even a couple of days have passed. Yeah, the world is small, the nurse laughed. How did you end up here? I hope the inhaler's not involved. She felt a warm, pleasant sensation inside. Her previous meeting with Raphael had left her with a nice feeling, like finding something long lost but dear to the heart. Oh, no, not at all. My son was waving his hands around during football practice last night and, well, seems like he broke a few fingers on the iron gate. Raphael ruffled the boy's hair, who was holding the ice pack. We went to a private clinic where we always get school certificates, but their x-ray machine was broken. They sent us here with a referral. And, well, here we are, just waiting. Oh, I wish him a speedy recovery. Clara smiled at the boy. So, what are you waiting for? Let me ask them to see you without the wait. No, we'll wait, Raphael stopped her. You've already done so much for me not long ago. Marcos is a real man now, he can endure, he's not a little kid. He looked at his son, who puffed up his cheeks and furrowed his brows. Clara smiled. I'm glad to see you, but work doesn't wait, she shrugged apologetically, already preparing to leave, when Raphael stopped her. Clara, if you don't mind. I was thinking. I'd like to invite you to dinner tomorrow, he blurted out. For some reason, the woman's cheeks turned pink, and her heart began to beat quickly and loudly, so much so that it seemed everyone in the hallway could hear it. Sure, what time? She forced herself to sound casual. And where? At 7 o'clock. Let's meet at the North Park entrance, and then we'll figure it out, Raphael replied. Okay, see you then. Clara awkwardly extended her hand for farewell. See you tomorrow. Raphael also shook her hand, a little awkwardly but gently. Surprisingly, the medical chart she needed was found quickly, right in the first shelf Clara checked. She tried to distract herself with work, but her heart was racing. She wasn't daydreaming, but she knew men didn't invite women to dinner out of mere politeness. She had caught Raphael's interest. And she liked him, too. After 15 minutes, Clara left the storage room and saw that Raphael and his son were still waiting, although the hallway was now empty. She shook her head but carefully slipped into the trauma doctor's office. Dr. Rodrigo Camarillo, Clara addressed the elderly doctor. There's a boy in the hallway with a broken finger, the son of a friend. Please take good care of him. I'll make sure to thank you. Clara, why are you silent? The doctor looked up from his papers and waved his hand. Of course, we'll take care of it. Call him in. Clara stepped out and nodded to Raphael and Marcos at the door. The man gave her a grateful look and quickly ushered his son to the appointment. What a strangely wonderful day, Clara murmured to herself as she found herself back outside. It seemed to her that the sun shone brighter, the flowers in the hospital garden were more lush, and the air suddenly smelled of hope and pleasant anticipation. That summer evening, on the terrace of a restaurant by the pond in the park, she kissed Raphael for the first time. Their relationship developed quickly, but very carefully and delicately. The man turned out to be a 39-year-old widower, raising his son alone. Clara felt awkward asking her new partner about his work. He, too, had avoided telling her for a long time that he ran a huge enterprise. Although Clara understood that the man pursuing her was far from a college student, she didn't fully realize just how wealthy Raphael was. But it didn't matter to her, as being with him made her feel like she was floating. Marcos didn't accept her right away, but when he finally did, Clara felt that her dreams of having children had unexpectedly come true. She enjoyed walking with the boy, holding his hand, buying sweets, praising him, or telling him stories. Raphael would smile quietly, watching how quickly his loved ones bonded. 4 months passed in this way. Despite her beloved's pleas, Clara refused to move into his luxurious apartment, though she often stayed over at his place. Raphael spoiled her with gifts and flowers, but after once being burned, Clara still had a deep, unspoken fear of losing her personal space. But when Raphael proposed to her in a restaurant during his cousin's birthday celebration, Clara melted completely. With tears in her eyes, she hugged him, and he placed the engagement ring on her finger. That evening was filled with congratulations and photos to remember, but the most dazzling thing wasn't the jewelry, it was the sparkle in the eyes of the happy woman. "How could I lose the one who saved my life but took my heart?" Raphael whispered into her ear as they danced in the dim light of the banquet hall. That winter, they had a quiet yet magnificent wedding, attended only by the closest of family and friends. Afterward, Raphael took his wife to a warm coastal retreat, leaving his son in the care of a nanny and his grandmother. Clara secretly couldn't believe how fortunate she was, as if she had stepped into a fairy tale. A superstitious woman, she carefully guarded her newfound happiness and didn't share many details with anyone, though her friends, mother, and former colleagues interrogated her. Why former? Raphael had helped her secure a job at a prestigious private pediatric clinic, where she was paid better and treated with more respect. At first, he wanted her to focus on the house and herself, but Clara protested. She loved her calling and had no intention of giving it up. In the end, her husband paid for her residency so she could achieve greater success in her career. Clara sold her pre-marriage apartment and deposited the money in the bank with interest, just as her husband had advised. As for the cat Damon, he became friends with Marcos's terrier, Max. And so, the new family lived together in harmony and happiness. For a long time, Clara didn't want to tell Raphael about her first marriage. It felt awkward, painful, and for some reason, shameful. It was an incident that prompted her to eventually open up. One evening, the couple was driving home, half listening to the radio. The announcer was enthusiastically talking about how the police had finally caught the gang that had been using various scams to steal apartments from elderly people. "What kind of monsters are these?" Raphael exclaimed. "They're taking the last of the pensioners' belongings." Clara nodded in agreement, then, almost without thinking, said, "I feel so sorry for those poor old people. I was almost in the same situation." "Someone sued you for the apartment?" Raphael asked, surprised, even turning to look at her. "And you never told me?" "Well, it was my ex-husband," Clara hesitated. "Our parents helped us buy that apartment, but he paid off part of the debt. After the divorce, I didn't even blink, and the apartment ended up with him." Raphael grimaced. "You're supposed to divide property equally." "That's strange, very strange." "In any case, I was unhappy in that apartment and was even glad to get rid of it," Clara said with a forced smile, eager to close the topic. Raphael was silent for a moment, then asked about their plans for the weekend. But in his mind, he decided to get to the bottom of what he had just heard. Raphael couldn't stand injustice. He always strived to do everything honestly and openly. That was how he did business. That was how he communicated with partners. That was how he raised his son. And what had happened in his wife's life, even before he came into it, made Raphael's inner sense of fairness stir, and he became determined to uncover the truth. "You know why I asked about the weekend?" Raphael remembered. "Maybe you should run some errands, buy a new dress?" Clara turned to her husband and stared at him in disbelief. Of course, Raphael loved her, was caring, and a thoughtful husband, but this? He was actually sending her to the shops? "Oh, you're being sneaky," she squinted slightly. "Sneaky," Raphael laughed, purposely mispronouncing the word. "You're so perceptive." "We're going somewhere," Clara guessed. "Yes," he confirmed. "Miguel finally asked his lady to marry him. He wants to throw a party in 2 weeks. We're invited, of course. Though I'd rather just go to a bar with him than spend the whole evening pretending to have social grace." "Hey, why didn't we have an engagement party?" Clara joked. Raphael looked at her as if she had just thrown a wad of cash out the window. "Because we're not crazy about American TV shows like Miguel and his future wife. I bet you anything she'll be throwing dinner parties and get-togethers for every little thing. Bought a new sofa? Call guests. Got a dog? Pop some champagne. Hung up a painting? Let's set off fireworks," Raphael went on. Clara couldn't help but burst out laughing. "You're such a grump," she said, wiping tears from her eyes. "What if it's fun, and you end up liking it?" "I hope so," Raphael agreed, his voice calming. "But in any case, you should be my star for the evening. So, this weekend, I'll call Gail, and you can take him for the whole day. Let him drive you around the malls and carry your shopping bags." "I don't think I'll ever get used to this," Clara mumbled. "I can't go shopping with you myself, and I don't understand any of it," Raphael gently stroked her hand. "So let my trusted person be with you, so I don't have to worry, all right?" "All right," Clara agreed. She still felt awkward about all the attention and was embarrassed to walk into high-end boutiques. However, her husband's confident voice and support were gradually helping her overcome this issue. Time moved forward, and the planned evening was getting closer. Raphael's business during the warm season was increasing, as work in the fields had started and farmers began to purchase agricultural machinery. He tried to be at the company and the large sales pavilion every day, despite having deputies and assistants. The phone rang endlessly. Sometimes he needed to go to the bank, sometimes meet with suppliers of assembly machinery, sometimes oversee purchases or sign papers. Amidst this chaos, Raphael nearly forgot that just the day after the engagement party of his cousin, Clara's birthday would arrive. He had long decided that his wife needed her own car, as they didn't always have the option to call Gail. Raphael spent a long time selecting the right car for her, comparing different models and evaluating options. He finally made his choice, but he hadn't yet managed to make the actual purchase. When he glanced at the calendar and realized that he might not have enough time to get the gift, he nearly grabbed his head in frustration. This happened during a business trip to the countryside, where journalists were shooting a segment about the new tractor model in the field. Raphael and the chief engineer mechanic were there as representatives of the manufacturer. Finally, when the materials were filmed and the interviews were done, it was around 3 p.m. Raphael quickly said goodbye to the journalists and colleagues, jumped into his SUV, and hurried off. Time always worked against busy people. He drummed his fingers on the steering wheel nervously, glancing at the GPS, which showed that the city was still an hour away. There was nothing to do but wait patiently and stay alert on the road. The car ahead of him overtook a sputtering truck. Raphael was about to follow suit when a sudden, instinctive feeling stopped him. And as it turned out, it was for good reason. A truck appeared out of nowhere in the opposite lane. The car, attempting to overtake, swerved to return to its lane but hit the wet shoulder from the rain and spun, heading straight for the ditch. The truck, screeching, slammed on its brakes, and Raphael also started slowing down, simultaneously watching the stricken car. Miraculously, it didn't flip over on the steep slope, leaving deep tire marks in the dirt from the driver's desperate attempts to regain control. Raphael parked a little to the side, without a second thought, and ran toward the accident scene. The truck driver rushed after him. "Are you okay? Is everyone all right?" Raphael peeked through the open driver's side window. Inside sat a young man, gripping the wheel so tightly that the knuckles had turned white. But, fortunately, he was fine. The young woman in the passenger seat had her hand pressed to her nose, with red drops dripping onto her t-shirt. "We're fine, thank God." The guy exhaled nervously. "Though I thought we weren't for a moment, the seatbelt saved me." "No broken bones, no head injuries?" "Let me get my first aid kit." Raphael looked over the couple with concern. "I think I broke my nose, but I'm not sure," the girl spoke with difficulty, tilting her head back. "I hit the dashboard with my face." Raphael made sure there were no serious injuries and rushed back to his vehicle. Meanwhile, the truck driver had approached the car, asked the driver something, and began inspecting the engine hood from below. While Raphael helped the female passenger clean up the scratches on her cheek, the elderly truck driver and the car's driver were attaching a tow rope. "We'll get your beauty out of here," the old man gave a thumbs up as he climbed into the truck. "Just need a little push, it spun around pretty badly." A few minutes later, Raphael rolled up his shirt sleeves and started pushing the car from behind, while the truck driver revved the engine. Grass and dirt flew from under the rear wheels, splattering Raphael's jeans and sneakers. The truck rumbled, the tow rope tightened, and the car awkwardly turned around before slowly crawling forward behind the truck. Once it was back on the road, its hazard lights blinked, and the old man turned off his truck, unhooked the tow rope, and tossed it into the bed. "There you go, just take it easy and head to the nearest workshop. Have them check the stabilizer bars, brakes, and tires," he advised the young man, who gratefully shook his hand. "Thanks for your help." The girl handed Raphael the cold water bottle she had been pressing to her nose. "No problem, any decent person would have done the same. Do you want me to drive you to the city if it's on my way?" he offered. The girl called out to the young man, who was still thanking the old man, whispered something to him, and he nodded in agreement. They all said their goodbyes and finally got back into their cars. The friendly local turned off at the nearest junction, honking his horn 3 times as a farewell. Raphael followed the couple to the city, where they no longer needed assistance or insurance. By the time Raphael finally arrived at the car dealership, it was almost 5 p.m. Raphael glanced at himself in the rearview mirror and even gave a slight smile. After an entire day in the field and the road adventures, he had ended up looking like he was from the nearest village. His hair was messy, his sneakers had earned their battle scars in the ditch, and his jeans were stained with grass and dirt. But there was no time to change. Quickly cleaning himself up with wet wipes and water from a bottle, Raphael grabbed his wallet and headed toward the entrance of the car dealership. "Raphael, I've never been to an event like this. I feel awkward," Clara whispered into her husband's ear as they entered the gate at the given address. The country villa where the party was held looked like something straight out of a foreign film. White walls with stained glass windows, 2 floors, a well-kept yard with various plants and paved white stone paths, a small garden, and a pool with lighting, surrounded by several tables offering food and drinks in a buffet style. Nearby, there was a DJ setup. Twinkling garlands of lights and lanterns stretched across the entire area, illuminating every corner. Guests who had already arrived were scattered around with glasses of champagne in hand, chatting and laughing. Men were in trousers or jeans with shirts, and women wore evening dresses and heels. "You look the best here, stop it." Raphael took his wife's hand and pointed to her reflection in the glass window. From there, Clara's image looked back at her, a slim, petite brunette with a beautiful, slightly messy bun, wearing a white figure-hugging dress with spaghetti straps and bright emerald-colored pumps that matched a clutch bag with the same color embroidery. She gave her husband a grateful look and smiled. Together, they headed toward the pool, where most of the guests were gathered. "Running late, brother," greeted Raphael's evening host, Miguel. The men firmly shook hands and embraced. "Clara, you look gorgeous," said Miguel's fiancée, Lola, as she appeared beside them. "Give me your hairdresser's number later." The casual small talk was interrupted by a guest approaching Miguel from behind. He turned, replied to something, and then turned back to Raphael and Clara. "By the way, I've been wanting to introduce you to my old college friend. This is Daniel and his wife, Esther." Miguel stepped aside, making way for the arriving guests. Clara gasped and grabbed her husband's elbow. Raphael, in turn, raised his eyebrows in a surprised glance. The unspoken greeting hung in the air. "And this is my cousin Raphael, the owner of the factory, and his wife Clara," Miguel continued. Suddenly, his phone rang, and with a quick "excuse me," the host hurried off to take the call. At that moment, Lola whisked away a group of her friends. When Miguel returned a minute later, his guests were still standing, staring at each other. "Did something happen while I was gone?" he asked. "I think we know each other," Daniel replied with a frown. He could feel Esther freezing beside him, and how the delicate glass in her fingers was almost about to crack from the tension. Daniel recognized the guest standing before him as the very picky country buyer, and his companion was barely recognizable as his ex-wife. Esther pressed her lips together, defiantly eyeing the woman she had considered a poor, shabby thing all this time. Now, she felt like she had stepped into a puddle. Her worst fears had come true. The dress and shoes on the shabby woman were more expensive and of better quality, and the large stone on her ring finger spoke louder than anything else. Know each other? Great, then you'll have plenty to talk about. I'm urgently needed by the hosts. Enjoy yourselves and don't hold back, Miguel said, before quickly walking away. Well, lovely evening, isn't it? Raphael tried to ease the tension. He understood who was in front of him but wasn't in a hurry to show it. Simply marvelous. Esther hissed in a sour voice, pinching her husband's wrist so hard that he winced and shifted his weight from one foot to the other. The situation was becoming increasingly absurd. Luckily for all four of them, someone in the group behind them accidentally knocked into a string of lights, which fell onto a table and pulled a dozen glasses down with it. The sound of shattering glass filled the air. Seizing the moment, Daniel and Esther slipped away to another part of the yard. If you want to leave, I'll understand. Raphael squeezed Clara's hand tightly. No, she replied, I'm not going to feed the ego of my ex-husband. Raphael kissed his wife on the cheek and, pulling her close, led her to the drinks table. The entire party, the couples kept their distance from each other, making sure to avoid crossing paths during games and mingling with the other guests. The celebration was lively, with a disco, prize draws, karaoke, and plenty of jokes. In the middle of the event, Miguel and Lola announced that they were also expecting all guests to attend their wedding. Oh, it's so hot. Clara sat on the edge of a small fountain in the garden. I never thought that such expensive shoes could rub my feet like this. Does it hurt? Raphael sat down in front of her and helped remove the shoes. Yeah, that's a pretty good blister. I'll get you a bandage and some cold water. You sit here for a bit. I'm not going anywhere with just one shoe on anyway, Clara smiled and shrugged. The awkwardness from meeting Daniel and his companion had mostly faded. Clara relaxed, dipping her hand into the fountain's basin. It was already close to midnight. Soon, the party would end with a celebratory fireworks display. Are you relaxing? Daniel approached the fountain. I guess, Clara stared at him warily. What are you doing here? I thought it was clear that neither of us wanted to have any interaction. Inside, she still felt the familiar knot in her stomach, everything tightened from the sharp sting of memories, but she forced herself to push them away. Oh, come on, Clara. Daniel smiled too sweetly and unsteadily. Now we're equals, why hold on to old grudges, huh? I don't think your wife will be thrilled with that idea, Clara nodded towards the crowd of guests. I'm not asking her, I'm my own man, Daniel proudly raised his nose. By the way, you look great. Clara remained silent, just watching him. She suddenly felt both disgusted and almost amused. What had she ever seen in this self-satisfied guy? What had she suffered through all those sleepless nights after he dumped her? Listen, let's forget the past. Daniel moved so close that Clara felt physically uncomfortable, instinctively pulling back. Fortunately, Raphael was already rushing toward them down the path. What grievances are we talking about? Raphael stood in a way that blocked Clara from Daniel's view. Maybe the one where you bribed the judge during the division of the joint apartment last year? Daniel stepped back, frozen as if struck by a dusty sack. Raphael handed Clara a glass of water with ice and continued, or maybe it's the fact that you and your employees could brush up on your sales ethics. Or perhaps the questionable legality of some of the car sales schemes at your dealership? So, which specific grievances did you want to discuss with my wife? I'll go, sorry, Daniel mumbled. The drinks had quickly turned him from a narcissist into a weed. Ashamed, the car dealership director stumbled and hurriedly left the scene. What a pathetic, disgusting guy, Raphael grimaced as he watched Daniel leave. You absolutely must take your rightful half of the apartment from him. I have a reliable and very strong lawyer, he'll tear that guy apart. Raphael, no need, Clara placed her hand on his forearm. I don't want to get back into that mess. Let him choke on that apartment. Life will punish him on its own. And how did you find out about all this? Raphael sat next to her, brushing a few stray strands of hair from Clara's forehead. I told you I have a lawyer friend, he said, squinting mysteriously. He used his connections, spoke to the right people, dug into the case, showed me the photos. I see, Clara murmured, glancing sideways. And what's this nonsense about cars and sales ethics? Oh, I was just looking for a gift for your birthday, Raphael confessed. A gift? In the dealership? Wait, don't tell me, Clara stared at her husband in astonishment, catching on to the idea. Tomorrow. Raphael laughed, hugging her. Give me at least some chance to surprise you. Above their heads, there was a series of loud pops, and the sky lit up with bright red and yellow bursts. Clara watched the fireworks, and it felt as though the night had been painted just for her. As if, in these bright flashes, the old her was burning away, the fearful, timid, and dependent woman who had once cared too much about the opinion of someone who had never loved her. After a while, the guests began to gradually leave. Clara and Raphael also said their goodbyes to Miguel and his fiancée, thanking them for their warm hospitality. Her foot was still sore from the uncomfortable shoe, and even the miracle-found bandage didn't help. It still hurts to walk, the nurse sighed, leaning against the wall. Without a word, Raphael scooped his startled wife into his arms and, to the astonishment of the remaining guests, carried her straight to the car. Clara felt like the happiest and most loved woman in the world. In the distance, Esther's frowning, displeased face briefly flashed, and beside her was Daniel, looking ashamed. But Clara no longer cared about them. Raphael gently opened the car door and carefully helped Clara into the passenger seat. I'm feeling a bit dizzy, she said, waving her hand, when her husband had already taken his place behind the wheel. I feel a little faint. Raphael looked at her carefully, not responding. What? Clara finally couldn't take it anymore. Why are you looking at me like that? My dear, you're suddenly feeling faint. You've been eating salty cucumbers, cheese, and olives for the past 2 weeks. And champagne turned your stomach, which is a good thing. Raphael began to smile slightly, listing the symptoms. It seems like you've already given yourself the main gift for tomorrow. Clara, still in disbelief, looked at him first, then at her hands and her reflection in the rearview mirror. How did I not notice? She muttered, and then everything clicked. Raphael immediately wrapped his arms tightly around her, stroking her hair and back. Let's go home, he said softly, my joy. The night city sped past the car window. Somewhere it was peaceful and already asleep, and elsewhere it was still noisy and bright. Clara dozed off, resting her head on her husband's shoulder. But even in her sleep, a serene smile never left her lips. Tomorrow would be a beautiful day, and then another, and another. Each new sunrise would be like this, when dreams slowly come true, and your hand is held by the person who loves and cherishes you.
If you're enjoying it as well, leave a like and subscribe to the channel.